Hi, it's Katrina. It's time to take a peek behind the curtain of history at lost treasures, forsaken kings, American atrocities, and the weird truth behind one of the most famous saints in the world. If that sounds good to you, be sure to subscribe and let's jump into it. Where is King Alaric's legendary treasure? In 410 AD, Rome fell to its knees. The greatest empire of the last 4 centuries was about to be dealt its killing blow. The Visigoths sacked the city, marking the end of a dynasty that would live on forever. And the man behind this incredible victory was Alaric, the first king of the Visigoths. I want to tell you about how Alaric defeated Rome, why he was buried in secret, and what happened to his lost treasure. The issue I have is that so much of what happened 1600 years ago is shrouded in mystery and myth. There isn't much known about Alaric's early life. He was born around 360 AD to a noble Goth family. Not goth like Marilyn Manson, black makeup and pentagrams. Goth as in the Goths. Alaric became king in 395 AD, and that's when the previous peace held between the Goths and the Romans was shattered. Alaric didn't defeat Rome on his first try. He invaded Italy and was pushed back. But instead of giving up, he recruited more soldiers. 30,000 Goth warriors who had been fighting for the Roman army defected and joined their countrymen. By the end of 408, Alaric and his army stood outside the walls of Rome. The siege was on. What happened next is a source of speculation. All scholars know about the siege of Rome comes from texts written in the Renaissance by authors who undoubtedly embellished old and already exaggerated legends. But there is one story that says Alaric besieged Rome for 2 years, finally defeating his enemies using a Trojan horse. This wasn't a giant wooden horse like during the Trojan War. Alaric gave the Romans 300 strong young men as slaves and then pretended to leave. Then, those slaves, who were actually warriors, opened the gates and the Visigoths flooded the city. Alaric didn't get to enjoy his victory for very long, though. In 411, just months after pillaging Rome, Alaric died. But nobody knows what caused his untimely demise. The legend states that Alaric was carried out into the countryside with treasure and was buried in a secret grave. Then, everyone who knew about the grave was killed so that none could ever find it. It's an almost identical story to Genghis Khan's lost tomb. Francesco Galassi and a group of his colleagues think they know why Alaric died. They believe that malaria was to blame. The Visigoths came from an area without malaria, so they were more susceptible to it than the Romans. But that's only a guess. The real mystery is the treasure. People have been trying to find King Alaric's loot for centuries, including Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler. Most recently, a team of archaeologists descended on the town of Cosenza to hunt for his tomb. But so far, they haven't found anything. The Pyramid Texts. Across ancient Egypt, the pyramid texts remain as powerful reminders of the magic wielded by the Egyptians. But these texts don't come in the form of books. They are engraved with unparalleled precision on the walls of tombs and temples. The hieroglyphics spell out protective invocations and mighty spells. But is this real magic? Archaeologists have divided the pyramid texts into 2 main categories. There were personal incantations used to guide a specific spirit from their tomb and into the realm of the afterlife. Then there were priest spells that were used during funerary rituals to force the spirit into the afterlife. The magic inscriptions were carved during what scientists call the Age of the Pyramids. This age lasted from 2700 until 2200 BC. It was when the most famous pyramids were built, like the ones in Giza. It was one of the richest times in Egyptian history, which is evident in the complexity of the religious texts. But there is one thing I can't quite understand, and maybe you can help me out. In the beginning, the pyramid texts were only used by kings. It was the pharaoh and his close family who had the protective invocations carved in their burial chambers. Everybody else was up Death's Creek without a battle. How are they supposed to pass through to the other side without the proper spells? This was a problem that ordinary people must have thought about a lot. It's one thing for a king to live in a better house than you kind of expect it. But for them to be the only ones with access to the afterlife because of their special spells seems totally unfair. In later years, a solution arose in the form of the Book of the Dead. Egyptian officials recently released photographs of an ancient copy of the Book of the Dead, written 2,000 years ago. The book, actually more of a scroll, is huge, 52 feet long. It contains all the necessary spells to get you to the afterlife. This book didn't have to be buried in your coffin, though it still could. The book could be read at your funeral so that you didn't fall into the great void and never find eternal peace. Nobody wants that. Here is a picture of it, courtesy of the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. Pretty cool, right? It's old and worn with an image of Osiris, the god of the underworld, on it. The old scroll was discovered in a tomb near the Step Pyramid of Djoser. And now for a quick break because it's shoutout time! I want to give a huge thank you to Andrew Johnson, who is a longtime subscriber, and Joe Pizak for supporting this channel. Thanks so much, guys! Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like this. Lost Yellowstone. Yellowstone National Park is one of America's greatest treasures. But did you know that it has a long and shocking history? A history that the government would prefer that everyone forget about. Long before Europeans arrived on the continent, it was the Native Americans who enjoyed Yellowstone Park. Archaeologist Doug MacDonald has spent 14 years excavating the park, discovering proof that Native groups were here. Proof such as obsidian projectile points from 3,000 years ago. The black, glassy rock was dangerously sharp, fastened to a piece of wood and then thrown at a bison to catch dinner. According to Doug MacDonald, Native Americans were hunting and gathering in Yellowstone for at least 11,000 consecutive years. Then came the United States government. After the park was established, the Army went to Yellowstone and removed all the Native Americans. Then the public was lied to with a crazy story that came from the Army. The Army said that Native Americans never lived in Yellowstone because they were scared of the geysers. But this is far from true. It's this kind of storytelling that's precisely how history gets corrupted. This lie was only a few decades ago, so imagine how much of the last 5,000 years has been misconstrued and misinterpreted. Historians probably don't know half as much as they think they do. Just a couple of years ago, Doug and his team discovered a Nez Perce encampment dating back to 1877. It was left behind when the U.S. cavalry chased them out of the park. It's a shocking story you may not have learned in school, and it might change your mind about going to Yellowstone. On August 24, 1877, a party of visitors from Montana camped out near Fountain Geyser. Yellowstone can be crowded today, but imagine being a tourist in 1877. These travelers had the whole place practically to themselves, right up until a group of Nez Perce warriors showed up. The warriors were at the front of a massive party who had fled from Oregon. Faced with being forced onto a reserve or just killed by the army, a band of about 800 left their ancestral homelands with the hope of finding new land somewhere else. But they were pursued by the army, with attacks along the way. The army didn't really care about their welfare. The Nez Perce tribe were hoping to reach the Sitting Bull in Canada, where they could continue to live their traditional lives. But it didn't work out that way. The tourist wagon was attacked and looted, and the Nez Perce were soon surrounded by the U.S. military. The last standing leader of the Nez Perce made a legendary speech when he surrendered. He said, "From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." That was the end of the conflict in the park. In 1878, a group of Bannock warriors fled Yellowstone after a violent attack in Idaho. The U.S. cavalry went on patrolling Yellowstone Park until about 1918 to make sure that the Native Americans didn't return to their old ancestral lands. Shane Doyle, a research associate at Montana State University and a member of the Absolute Nation, called Yellowstone Park a slap in the face to Native people. It's just a quick glimpse into the dark history of the United States that you probably didn't learn in school. The truth about St. Patrick's Day. I know a lot of people recently celebrated St. Patrick's Day, but I'd like to take a minute to tell you about the bizarre history of St. Patrick. It's weirder than you could possibly imagine. The man himself was born in Great Britain, not Ireland. He was born to wealthy parents, meaning he was part of the upper class in Britain. This was at the end of the 4th century, around 1600 years ago. He was born right around the same time that King Alaric was burning down Rome. Patrick's father was a Christian deacon, though probably not because of his faith in God. He may have been a deacon simply because he received tax incentives. Patrick didn't start his life particularly religious. At the age of 16, he was taken prisoner by some Irish raiders. They were sort of like Irish Vikings, looting and pillaging. St. Patrick was forced to work in Ireland as a shepherd. He was alone and afraid, so he turned to Christianity. Once he escaped, he vowed to return to Ireland and convert everyone to Christianity. The myth is that when Patrick went back to Ireland, he stood on a tall hill and delivered a ground-shattering sermon. Apparently, it was so powerful that all the slippery serpents fled into the ocean. This is the main myth that everyone knows about St. Patrick, but it's a lie. It's true Ireland doesn't have any snakes, but the Emerald Isle has always been free of snakes while humans have lived on it. Geological evidence shows that Ireland, long before the Ice Age, was covered in thick ice. It was way too cold for snakes to take root there. Instead, the serpent myth likely comes from the idea that Patrick eradicated pagan ideology. But he didn't really do that either. Pope Celestine had already sent Bishop Palladius to Ireland in 431 to convert the Irish to Christianity. There are many scholars who think St. Patrick's myth is ripped off from the real story of Palladius. This could explain the real shocking truth. St. Patrick isn't even a saint. He is the patron saint of Ireland, but he isn't recognized by the Catholic Church. There are some crazy saints out there, like Magnus the Raider, who came from a family of savage Vikings, or the bloodthirsty Saint Olga of Kiev. But Patrick is not a saint, which suggests that the Church knows that his whole story is a lie. The Lost Catacombs of Lima. Underneath the vibrant and colorful streets of Lima, there lies a secret treasure you won't believe. It's not a treasure like the one buried with King Alaric. This treasure is more like the one hidden beneath the streets of Paris. It's one of death, skeletons, and forbidden history. I take you first to the Basilica and Convent of San Francisco, located in Peru's capital city. Underneath the basilica is a series of ancient tunnels that were built in 1549 by the Order of Franciscans. During the Spanish colonial era of Peru, these dark and creepy catacombs were used by the Franciscan monks for burials. Over the next couple of centuries, 25,000 people were buried in the twisting passageways, much like the legendary Paris catacombs. But then they were forgotten. By 1810, people had stopped being buried in the grotesque underground corridors. The Peruvian War of Independence was underway and things were changing. Locals forgot all about the catacombs for the next century and a half. They weren't rediscovered until 1951. Even today, the true scope of the tunnels is unknown. They stretch way beneath Lima, connecting a variety of famous landmarks like the Government Palace and the Alameda de los Descalzos. But they go even deeper, defying all explanation. Scientists have been trying to map the whole complex since 1981, but they have failed at every attempt. Are these dark recesses only the remains of crypts? Or is there more to the tunnels under Lima than historians realize? Let me know your thoughts down below. The secret plot to save the gold. In 1978, an incredible amount of treasure was discovered in Afghanistan. The treasure represented centuries of wealth from the Silk Road that traveled from China to Europe. It was impressive, to say the least. There were thousands of gold pieces from all across the ancient world, and this was Silk Road treasure, meaning it came from every corner of the globe. But then came turmoil. As conflict engulfed Afghanistan, it became necessary to get the gold out of the country. So a secret plan was launched to retrieve the treasure. And this is the story of that top-secret mission. The treasure was found by Russian archaeologist Viktor Sarianidi at the Tilya Tepe site in the Bactria region. Bactria was an ancient place that you don't hear much of anymore, yet it hosted so many civilizations over the years. Scythian horse lords lived in Bactria along with Chinese nomads. It was also briefly occupied by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC. When Rome started to rise in the west, India, China, and Iran fought for control over Bactria. Victor and his team found 6 tombs dating from between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. That's a span of 200 years. There were over 20,000 objects found across the tombs, mostly gold and jewelry. There was enough treasure here to make you a very, very wealthy person. The graves likely belonged to rich Asian nomads. One of the tombs, that of an unnamed woman, even had a golden crown in it. The rest of the tombs were filled with things like silver mirrors engraved in Chinese script, gold rings covered in Greek text, and coins with Buddhist imagery on them. Coins with the heads of Roman emperors on them have also been found. I think you get the idea of how international this treasure was. The year after the discovery was made, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Fast forward to 1988, the Soviet troops were on their way out. The president of Afghanistan at the time was worried about the treasure. With the Soviets leaving, he suspected that Afghanistan was going to fall into chaos and anarchy. He knew the National Museum of Afghanistan wasn't going to remain a safe place for the Bactrian gold much longer. And he was right. In 1993, the National Museum was hit by a missile. To put this into perspective, imagine if the Smithsonian Museum was suddenly bombarded by a missile. All of those priceless relics blown to smithereens. That was what happened in Afghanistan. The treasure that wasn't destroyed was looted, and much of it is still lost today. Thankfully, though, the president had secretly hidden the Bactrian gold away using a team of covert operatives. They didn't reveal the location of the gold until 2003, after the Taliban was overthrown. The treasure had been hidden in a vault. With things seemingly safe, the treasure was removed. It was cataloged by the National Geographic Society and was then brought back to the renovated museum. Story over, right? Wrong. The danger has returned. The Taliban were overthrown, but now they are in power like never before. The Bactrian gold, the greatest hoard in Afghan history, is missing yet again. The treasure was brought to the presidential palace in February of 2021. But once the government collapsed, the treasure disappeared, and nobody knows what happened to it. The Taliban were desperately trying to find it that same year. As of right now, it's nowhere to be seen. Something tells me this is a repeat of the 1980s. Someone with a lot of power has likely stashed the treasure in a top-secret hiding place. Giant skeletons in Canada. On October 16, 1872, the Perry County Democrat published something peculiar in the miscellaneous section of their paper. It was a story about a graveyard of giants, a story from the other side of the border. In a small Canadian farm town along the banks of the Grand River, Daniel Fradenberg unearthed 200 skeletons. The skeletons were humongous, and I mean humongous. They stood an unbelievable 9 feet from their bony toes to their bare, pale skulls. And the graves contained more than just the bodies of giants. These skeletons wore strings of beads around their neck. Some of them had big stones shoved in their jaws, as if it were part of some strange burial ritual. There were also stone axes scattered around the dirt, suggesting that the giants were part of a primitive prehistoric tribe. The story also appeared in the Toronto Daily Telegraph, explaining how the farm had already been cultivated for the past 100 years. When farmers first arrived in the area, the land was covered in a thick pine forest. There was no evidence that anyone had ever lived on Daniel Fradenberg's farm, but clearly someone had. Only they weren't exactly people. They were giants. I know a lot of these more unusual stories that you hear are fake, with fake people in them, fake experts, and even fake places. But take a look at this image. It's from the Canadian County Atlas Digital Project, which keeps track of local Ontario property owners. You can see that Daniel A. Fradenberg was a real person from Cayuga South in the 1870s. This doesn't prove that Daniel found 200 skeletal giants, but it proves that he was real. It puts enough realness into the story to make you really wonder what happened to those skeletons that he found. Some believe that he came across an Indian burial ground, which happened to contain the remains of shockingly tall Native Americans. Others think that Daniel found the bones of a mastodon or a mammoth and mistook them for humans. But I'm more interested in what you think. Let me know in the comments. The pyramid in Kazakhstan. Archaeologists have discovered a totally new pyramid in a place you wouldn't guess in a million years. Not China, not Japan, it's nowhere in the Middle East or Africa. A pyramid from 3,800 years ago was uncovered in Kazakhstan. A lot of people only know Kazakhstan because it's the homeland of Borat, but it's so much more than that. The culturally rich nation is part of the Eurasian steppe, sprawling between Russia, Mongolia, and Kyrgyzstan. It was in the eastern part of the country where the shocking pyramid was discovered. In a statement released by the Eurasian National University, the pyramid is unlike anything that's ever been found before. It's a hexagonal pyramid that's flanked by enormous megaliths and arranged like a labyrinth. Although archaeologists are calling it a pyramid, it's not what you might be thinking. It bears little resemblance to the pyramids of the Maya, the Egyptians, or the Nubians. It was more like the earthen mounds found at Cahokia, but that still doesn't quite explain it, so let me break down its features. The outer stone walls of the monument form a massive hexagon, with the inner walls built like a maze leading to a central grave at the heart of the pyramid. Researchers are calling it a pyramid because parts of it were covered by huge mounds of earth. From the outside, it would have looked like a dirt pyramid, but on the inside, it was a twisting labyrinth leading to a shallow tomb. Scientists know pretty much nothing else about the pyramid, its empty grave, or the culture responsible for building it. Kazakhstan was home to dozens of nomadic cultures over the centuries, and apparently one of them, at least one time, decided to try their hand at pyramid building. Perhaps they had traveled to Egypt and got inspired. The prehistoric mystery girl. It's time to meet one of the most unique prehistoric girls that ever lived. Her name is Denny, and her parents were more progressive than anyone alive today. Her parents weren't just in an interracial relationship, they belonged to two different species. Denny was born to Neanderthal and Denisovan parents. Denny is an intriguing look into the lost history of human evolution, even if she isn't human at all. Her bones are the only ones that have ever been found of a first-generation human hybrid, though she wouldn't have been the only one. It's just that scientists have never found another example. They discovered her bones in 2012 while excavating Denisova Cave in Siberia's Altai Mountains. It took 6 years for scientists to complete their DNA analysis of the finger bones. They learned that Denny was alive 90,000 years ago. They were also able to figure out that her mother was a Neanderthal and her father was a Denisovan. Study author Svante Pabo said that the evidence is so direct, it's almost like scientists caught them in the act. But what's the big deal about a little interspecies mingling? Neanderthals and Denisovans were closely related to Homo sapiens, yet both went extinct, and we didn't. They lived in Eurasia until Homo sapiens showed up roughly 40,000 years ago. When modern humans arrived, these other species just kind of evaporated. Though it could have been more violent than that, scientists speculate that humans may have wiped out the competition. There are a few other interesting aspects of the mystery you should know. Neanderthal remains have been found all over the place, from Europe to Asia and across the Near East. But the only evidence of Denisovans has been found in Denisova Cave, along with one other specimen in Tibet. That's not a lot of evidence to go on. Scientists know almost nothing about Denisovans. Not even really what they look like. But still, it's safe to say that if they were breeding with Neanderthals, they must have looked fairly similar enough to mate and raise children together. If you're of European descent, you almost definitely have Neanderthal genes still tucked away in your genome. And if your ancestors are from Southeast Asia, you likely carry Denisovan genes in your DNA. We are all Homo sapiens, but our ancestors were a little different. Denny is the personification of the human evolution mystery. She reminds us that our story is one of hybridization. She's also a kind of missing link that scientists can't understand. Were Homo sapiens the result of interspecies breeding? Are we the final rendition of a dozen different species mixing their DNA? So many questions. Is the Welsh Atlantis real? Wales has its very own Atlantis, a place of legend that may or may not have been real. At the northwestern tip of Wales is a strange rock formation called the Great Orme. Legend has it that a Viking raiding party saw the rock and mistook it for a giant serpent, fleeing in terror. But another legend says the Great Orme is a rocky ruin from the destroyed city of Tino Helig. The tale of the Welsh Atlantis starts with Helig ab Gwynnog, the prince of Tino Helig. For you Welsh speakers out there, I am so sorry for butchering these names. But in any case, Helig ruled the mighty city in the 6th century AD, with his territory stretching from Flintshire to Conwy. The prince's great palace was about 2 miles from where the coastline is now, right where Conwy Bay is situated. Or in other words, his palace is currently underwater. The legend centers more around Helig's daughter, Gwendid, who was beautiful but had a wicked and ugly heart. She was wooed by the son of a local baron in Snowdon named Tethal. Succumbing to his charms, she wished to marry him, but said that he wasn't of high enough birth. Tethal was so upset, as you can imagine, that he decided to get himself one of the golden collars worn by noblemen, known as a torque. He thought this would convince Gwendid that he was worth marrying. Since Tethal had no legitimate way of getting himself a golden collar, he turned to murder. He slayed a Scottish chieftain and stole his torque. He thought that he got away with the crime, only for the chieftain's ghost to show up and curse him. Tethal wasn't bothered by a silly curse. He had himself a golden collar and was able to convince the wicked Princess Gwendid to take his hand in marriage. He forgot all about the curse and lived a happy life with Gwendid until the pair was old and gray. It was only when their great-great-grandchild was born that the curse caught up to their family. On a night of celebration, the royal palace was hit by a flood. At that point, does it really matter though about the curse? But anyway, on a night of celebration, the royal palace was hit by a flood. Water crept into the cellar with fish flopping against the wine racks. The only people who escaped were a maid and her lover, a court minstrel. They fled the palace just as mighty waves crashed upon it. They kept scrambling up and away until they reached a tall hill. They looked down as the sun rose and saw all of Tino Helig submerged. It's a fable that goes back centuries, with nobody knowing how true it is. Some locals say that during low tide, you can see the ruins of the old palace sticking out above the surface of the bay. Archaeologists have even confirmed that until recently, a large part of the bay had been a forest. So maybe there really is a sunken city down there somewhere. The Imperial Library of Constantinople. So much history was lost with the destruction of this remarkable library that it brings a tear to every librarian's eye when they think about it. In 357, Byzantine Emperor Constantius II became aware of a problem. There was an issue with a lot of early papyrus scrolls deteriorating. Impressive knowledge from the ancient Egyptians, along with wisdom collected from all corners of the known world, were succumbing to the decay of time. History was literally crumbling into dust. Constantius wanted to safeguard the world's history by forming a library and replacing the worn scrolls with more modern parchment and vellum books. This led to the development of the Imperial Library of Constantinople. Scribes worked overtime to copy the papyrus documents onto parchment. This was all done under the direct supervision of esteemed scholar Themestios. Works that had only recently been saved from the burning of the Library of Alexandria were preserved here. The work was too much to finish in one lifetime. It continued for another 11 centuries, until the library was bursting with volumes, book scrolls, and codices. But how many? I don't know for sure. Nobody does. There are conflicting reports and nothing in the way of concrete information. It could have had anywhere between 100,000 and 1 million volumes on its shelves. The sad part is that now all of the records are gone. During the Fourth Crusade in 1204, the Imperial Library was destroyed. The Norman Crusaders sacked Constantinople, tearing down the city like it was built of sticks and clay. They burned the library and almost everything in it. Think about those poor books from the Library of Alexandria. How they escaped one massive burning just to be incinerated anyway. And what's even worse is that the ones that were saved from both fires were destroyed in a third disaster. 60 years later, when Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos reconquered Constantinople, he re-established the library in the Great Palace. The books that weren't looted or burned were put under his protection. But it was all in vain. In 1453, the Turks destroyed the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, and all of the books in the library. Just think of all of that ancient knowledge just gone. The many wives of Pepi II. You hear about the history and mystery of the pyramids of Giza all the time, but what about the very last great pyramid complex built in ancient Egypt? It's time to learn the secret history of Pepi II and his many queens. In southern Saqqara, there stands a crumbling pyramid that was first excavated by Gaston Maspero in 1881. It would take over 100 years of investigations for Egyptologists to recreate the temple, the courtyard, the causeway, the chapel, and the 4 pyramids built by Pepi II. And believe me when I say that the funerary complex was beyond impressive. There was the main pyramid for the king himself, then there was a cultic pyramid known as a Ka pyramid, plus the 3 medium-sized pyramids built for the pharaoh's 3 favorite queens. You couldn't rule Egypt and just have one queen. Pepi was the younger brother of Merenre I and was one of the last pharaohs of the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is also known as the Age of the Pyramids, stretching from 2700 to 2200 BC. It was during this age when all the greatest pyramids were built, and all the coolest monuments of ancient Egypt appeared. Over the following 4,200 years, Egypt never really reached the same heights. The decline began with Pepi. Poor Pepi. He was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a child star. Pepi became the ruler of Egypt at the young age of 6. His reign began in 2278 BC and lasted an unprecedented 94 years. Here's a fact to impress your friends with. Pepi II was the second longest reigning monarch in human history, next to Min Hiti of the Langye dynasty in Myanmar. Pepi's reign was only shorter by a few months. Gaining such great power at such a young age no doubt affected the boy pharaoh. But the decline of Egypt's superiority wasn't all his fault. It's important to understand that during the Old Kingdom, Egypt was divided into 42 provinces known as nomes. Each province was governed by a nomarch, which would be equivalent to a state governor today. Not a monarch, but a nomarch. When Pepi came to the throne, the nomarchs started seizing more power than they should have. Nomarchs didn't want to be simple governors of a small province. They all wanted more and more and more. This resulted in civil wars breaking out all over the country. But still, Pepi managed to hold Egypt together. It wasn't until his death that the Old Kingdom totally disintegrated and fell into anarchy. Some scholars have described it as the Egyptian Dark Ages. Over his extremely long life, how many wives do you think Pepi had? How many wives could a man have over 94 years of kingship? He married at least 6 women, with 3 of them all given their own pyramids at his mortuary complex. He likely had way more wives, but the 6 known to history were his most important. They were all, except for one, related to him, either as sisters or cousins. Might seem weird now, but hey, that was ancient Egypt for you. Thanks for watching! Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and stick around for older content you might have missed.
The Vimana. The Vimana is a powerful flying machine described in Sanskrit texts from ancient India. We can find mention of the Vimana in all kinds of these ancient writings, from the Ramayana to the Yajurveda. It's almost always described as the same thing. It was an enormous temple or a palace which could fly through the sky like a floating city. Not only could the Vimana travel through the atmosphere, but they could also fly to space and dive underwater. Imagine the biggest temple you can think of, but it can launch itself into space to visit other planets. Weirdly enough, legends of the Vimana gave specific details about how the mysterious thing achieved its flight. It was described as having at least 2 engines, although no one can explain how the ancients even knew what an engine was. The flying fortress was also said to have deadly weapons, things that could wipe out entire civilizations. They could be used for ordinary travel to get from one place to another, or for warfare. Scientifically, there is no evidence that the Vimana was real. Archaeologists have never found any proof that flying machines soared above the skies of India, but that doesn't mean one didn't exist. Judging by how many stories of flying machines there are in ancient Indian texts, the idea came from somewhere, maybe somebody or something, which was mistaken for a god by the original inhabitants of India, visited using an advanced spaceship. But because the locals understood nothing about space travel, they just described it as a flying temple. What do you think? Just ancient mythology or something else? Let me know in the comments below. The stone monuments of Nuku Hiva. These stone monuments of Nuku Hiva are quite strange. For those unfamiliar with this place, Nuku Hiva is a large French Polynesian island in the Pacific Ocean. It's famous for the stone monuments scattered across its beautiful and isolated landscape. Most of these stone monuments are at a small settlement called Temehea Tohua. Archaeologists say they were created between the 11th and 14th centuries, and that every statue is a depiction of one of the ancient deities of Nuku Hiva. And although these deities are ancient, some are still being worshipped today. What we know is that the original inhabitants of this tropical island arrived several thousand years ago, and although their culture has changed since then, their origin story has remained more or less the same. According to the people of Nuku Hiva, the god of creation is Ono. He created the Polynesian islands as a gift to his wife, taking the earth and turning it into a giant palace. But that palace eventually decayed, and the islands are what remains of its walls and roof. Another interesting thing about these people is that there were once way too many of them. The island itself had about 100,000 people. This made it almost impossible for communities to live and eat. They had food shortages, there weren't enough fish, and supposedly the people of the island resorted to organized cannibalism. Under the trees of Nuku Hiva and beyond, the tropical coastline has a secret history of blood and death. The Roman financial crisis. When most of us think about ancient Rome, we think of wealth, powerful armies, and an undying legacy. But there is a less talked about, more forbidden part of Roman history that may just be a warning for our own grim future. Historian Charles Bartlett recently compared something that happened in Rome 2,000 years ago to the economic crisis of 2008. In the year 33 AD, the Roman Empire plunged into economic chaos. This happened when rulers passed a law that required creditors to invest part of their capital in Italian lands. The money was used to help with agriculture, create more beautiful pieces of architecture, and solidify the foundation of Rome. Everyone was supposed to be a winner. But what happened is that creditors rushed to buy as much land as they could. It created a credit crunch. The Roman Emperor Tiberius had to free up vast sums of money for interest-free loans to stop the crisis from getting any worse. In simple terms, land became suddenly valuable in Italy. Those with the credit to purchase the land did it as quickly as they could, but to do it they had to call in all their debts. Debtors then went broke. They purchased too much land and prices dropped. There was a desperate buy and sell spree, credit was non-existent, and the land value plummeted as interest rates were driven up sharply. It was a mess, almost like what happened in 2008. What many people don't realize is that the same thing that happened in the modern world already happened in the Roman world. And we all know how that ended. The prophet Daniel. The prophecy of Daniel is a book in the Old Testament, and like anything having to do with the Bible, there is a great divide between what archaeologists say and what the religious believers say. But what happens when that line is blurred? To give you an example, scholars didn't think King David was a real person until 1993, when they discovered artifacts in Jerusalem proving beyond a doubt that King David lived and breathed. Theologians did not believe that Belshazzar was an actual figure, but just a character in the Bible. Daniel, in chapters 5, 7, and 8, mentions Belshazzar 8 times, and in the year 1854, archaeologists discovered 4 ancient cuneiform cylinders in Ur, the greatest city of Old Babylonia. These cylinders mentioned Belshazzar, son of King Nabonidus. No matter which side you're on, science or faith, archaeological evidence shows much of what was written in the prophecy of Daniel is non-fiction. Look at King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, between 605 BC and 562 BC. The Bible says he was driven away from men and ate grass like an ox, while his hair grew like feathers and his nails became birds' claws. Historians believe this part of the Bible can be explained by a weird psychological disease called boanthropy. It's when a person goes completely insane and acts like a cow, walking on all fours in a field and eating grass. It's a strange mental disorder allegedly brought on by dreams or hypnotism. The Knights Templar. On Christmas 1119, Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, persuaded a group of French knights to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. This was the formation of the Order of the Knights Templar. These knights lived like monks, took vows of chastity and poverty, and would protect peasants and civilians against enemies using violence. At least this was how they started. But just shy of 200 years later, in 1314, the Crusades were over. The church abolished the Templars, and they burned the Grand Master of the order at the stake in Paris. It was a miserable and fiery end for what is one of the most mysterious orders that ever existed. One thing you might not know is the connection between the Freemasons and the Knights Templar. Spoiler alert, there isn't one. Frank Sanello, a professional historian, explained in 2003 that Andrew Ramsay, a senior French Freemason of the 18th century, made up the link between the Freemasons and the Crusaders. He was the first one to claim that the Freemasons had descended from the order. It was all a trick to appeal to the French aristocracy to get more members. What's your favorite conspiracy theory involving the Knights Templar? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. The Hill of Torture. On a hilltop in Auriesville, New York is the Hill of Torture. On this hill is something that most Americans have probably never heard of. There is a shrine dedicated to 3 American martyrs of the 17th century. They are a trio who shed their blood for Christ right on this very spot in the 1640s. They were actually missionaries trying to convert the Native Americans, who weren't really interested, and you can probably understand why. Invading their land, bringing disease, and insulting their religion. You get it. But these 3 died pretty awful deaths. These 3 martyrs had been trying to spread the word of Jesus to the New World. Father Isaac Jogues died from being hit in the head with a tomahawk. Ren Goupil and John Lalande had their fingernails ripped out and their teeth pulled one by one. Their torture was so heinous that the men went down in history as martyrs and were given their own holy hill in New York. The Saia lead plates. The Saia lead plates are fake nonsense, or are some of the most priceless artifacts in the world. Experts can't quite figure it out. The lead plates were supposedly cast from the solid gold originals, with the inscriptions of an unknown language, a language made with the Greek alphabet and a few random unknown characters. They were discovered in a warehouse at the Bucharest Museum of Antiquities in Romania back in the 1800s. There were 200 pieces in the collection, and nobody has any idea where they came from. They just showed up there. Photos were taken proving that there were indeed 200 pieces, but only 35 are left today. When they were first found, professionals at the museum disregarded the plates as forgeries. They looked too new. They couldn't find any traces of erosion on the plates, and the gold originals were nowhere to be found. Still, these treasures were valuable enough to be removed in 1916 when World War I broke out. It wasn't until 2003 that interest was renewed in the mysterious artifacts. Some said the original gold copies had been kept at the Saia Monastery in Romania, then used to build Peles Castle. Nobody has ever deciphered the language on the plates. Plus, an analysis by the Institute of Atomic Physics concluded they were probably made from lead in the 19th century. And so, the mystery of the plates continues. The treasure of the Gattis. The treasure of the Gattis is another bizarre trove of artifacts that may or may not be real. This treasure comprises massive amounts of gold, silver, and electrum, relics that are supposedly hidden deep in Ecuador in the Gattis mountain range. The Incan general Rumi Nahui put them there in the 16th century. To understand this better, we need to start at 1532 with Francisco Pizarro. He established the town of San Miguel de Piura and began his glorious conquest of the Inca Empire. He captured King Atahualpa at Cajamarca, and the king offered to give him vast amounts of gold for his life and freedom. Naturally, Francisco agreed. Things went wrong quickly. The Spaniard didn't trust the Inca king, and he had him killed in July 1533. But according to legend, his general, Rumi Nahui, had been on his way there with the gold for the ransom at the time of the king's death. When he learned of the treachery, he changed his course and hauled the treasure deep into the mountains. It's allegedly still there, somewhere hiding in a cave or at the bottom of a lake. the Meowing nuns. There is a bizarre story about a case of mass hysteria which possessed a secluded convent of nuns in France during the Middle Ages. We don't have an exact year, but the nuns were apparently overcome with the desire to meow like cats. These nuns slowly went insane, meowing for hours at a time, and would only stop when soldiers beat and whipped them. Shortly after this original case, the same thing happened in Germany in the 15th century. This time, a group of nuns bit each other. News traveled through the region, and other nuns at other nunneries had the same problem. It was a biting epidemic, and it spread as far as Holland and Rome. This is a real thing that happened based on historical records all across Europe, and yet nobody knows why it happened. Reports from the 15th century say the nuns would continue to bite each other until they were exhausted. They meowed like cats, bit strangers, and it was all around very weird. It only stopped when religious leaders turned to the civil authorities to have the nuns flogged, dunked in barrels of water, and thrown in prison. Order was eventually restored, and there have been very few outbreaks of biting mania ever since. The Church of the Holy Sepulcher. In Jerusalem, there are thousands of tiny medieval crosses carved into the walls of the holiest church in the world. It's the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, the sacred site allegedly built on the place where the Romans crucified Jesus. Religious scholars have chalked up the crosses to graffiti left behind by medieval pilgrims. A recent study of the crosses shows they were masons. Researcher Amit Rehem analyzed every inch of each cross on the wall. He looked at the depth, the width, and the hand of the people who carved them. What he discovered is that the crosses were likely all carved by the same person, or by just one or two people. Why did they do this? The best guess archaeologists have is that pilgrims from all over Europe journeyed to the church and then paid a stonemason to carve a cross for them on the wall. They saved the dust created by the carving as a sacred keepsake. Pilgrims probably put the dust in a small lead flask, then took it home as their own piece of the Holy Land. And while the case of the crosses is mysterious, the church itself is the big mystery here. We know the Church of the Holy Sepulcher was built in the 4th century. According to legend, it was the mother of the great Roman Emperor Constantine, Saint Helena, who traveled to Jerusalem and discovered the exact spot where Jesus had been crucified, buried, and subsequently resurrected. Constantine then had the basilica built, which became the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. In modern times, no proof has ever been discovered that this was the place where Jesus Christ came back to life. Anunnaki Aliens. Many conspiracy theorists believe that shape-shifting alien reptiles have infiltrated the human population with sinister plans to enslave us. These alleged ill-intending aliens are called the Anunnaki. They hide in plain sight, mingling with powerful politicians and other elite members of society. BBC sports reporter David Icke claims these Anunnaki, or the reptiles, have controlled humankind since ancient times. They count among their number Queen Elizabeth, George W. Bush, Henry Kissinger, Bill and Hillary Clinton, and Bob Hope. David further claims that the lizards are behind secret societies like the Freemasons and the Illuminati. Some even believe that the Anunnaki arrived on Earth around 200,000 years ago and created humans as a slave race to mine gold. According to the theory, they engineered our existence using their DNA, and they can activate bits and pieces of it to stop us from becoming as smart as them. The Anunnaki allegedly brought sophisticated technology here and passed it on to the people they created, making ancient societies more advanced than modern humans. But these ancient societies lost the technology at some point or another, and today's experts have only found scant remains of it. The Anunnaki were actually real, but not in the way you might think of them now. The Anunnaki were actually gods of the ancient Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians. They believed that the Anunnaki passed judgment on the human race. They were heavenly beings that shaped the destiny of early society. In recent years, things have changed. There are rumors circulating online about the discovery of the intact body of an Anunnaki king. A team of workers in Iran reportedly found the unusually well-preserved remains while digging a foundation for a home, when they stumbled upon a mausoleum containing 3 coffins. Archaeologists allegedly determined that the site was part of a city dating back sometime between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago. but Iranian authorities dispute these claims and say that the remains are 850 years old. While the Anunnaki were actually very important ancient gods, for some reason, many people now believe they were much more than that. And the reason the Sumerians and Babylonians were so clever and advanced was because they had outside help. Vatican Secret Archives. Recently renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives, the Vatican Secret Archives contains millions of documents covering a 12th century time span, which were officially classified as secret until last year. The facility itself, which was established during the 16th century, hasn't operated secretly in quite some time, but it's also not open to just anyone. Vatican officials allow qualified researchers into the secret archives after a thorough vetting process. They have access to documents that aren't available to the public, including the Chinon parchment, which details the trial minutes against the Knights Templar and reveals that Pope Clement V absolved the group of heresy in 1308. The secret archives also house Pope Leo X's papal bull excommunicating Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, not Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther was famously excommunicated from the Catholic Church and caused quite the ruckus. It's home to countless other historical documents, which are kept in the facility's 53 miles of shelving and in its underground vault, known as the bunker. Over time, the secret archives are becoming less secretive. In recent years, the Vatican allowed journalists to take a tour for the first time, and the facility's recent name change to the Vatican Apostolic Archives reflects the Church's trying to increase its transparency. Man in the Iron Mask. It's rare for someone to go down in history with no one knowing their real identity, but it has happened. Take, for example, the unidentified 17th century prisoner known as the Man in the Iron Mask. Authorities held him in various French prisons over a more than 30-year period after being arrested in 1669. The man wore a black velvet mask over his face until his dying day in 1703, leaving his identity a mystery. People have been trying to figure out who the Man in the Mask was since his imprisonment. Writer Alexander Dumas and the renowned philosopher Voltaire theorized he was the twin brother of Louis XIV, but scholars have since debunked this claim. Most modern-day experts agree that the prisoner's name was Eustache d'Alger, according to historian Paul Sonino. He was a valet, but it's unclear whose valet he was, and why officials kept him under such tight watch for over 30 years. After extensively examining historical records, Sonino claimed in 2017 that d'Alger was the valet for the treasure of a wealthy and high-ranking church official named Cardinal Mazarin. Evidence suggests that Mazarin may have accumulated some of his vast fortunes by swindling English royalty. Sonino believes the treasurer caught on to Mazarin's dirty deeds and that d'Alger slipped up and mentioned it to the wrong person, resulting in his lifelong imprisonment along with threats of execution if he ever disclosed his identity. China's Spy Museum. The Jiangsu National Security Education Exhibition Hall, better known as China's Spy Museum, opened in 2009. Los Angeles Times special correspondent Violet Law described the site as a propaganda showcase featuring weapons disguised as lipstick and cigarettes, as well as listening devices and containers for concealing secret documents, such as hollowed-out coins. China has reportedly dedicated the Spy Museum's second floor to countries it perceives as security threats, including Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and Vietnam. There is also a section devoted only to the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. China's lawmakers have dedicated the museum's biggest display to groups who are domestic threats in China, including Tibetans, Uyghurs, and followers of the outlawed Falun Gong spiritual practice. The government allowed only Chinese citizens inside the Spy Museum until relatively recently. Shortly after its grand opening, a spokesperson announced the museum did not want to expose, in their words, such sensitive spy information to foreigners. What else do you think is on display there? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. The Grand Grimoire. A grimoire is a magic textbook that contains instructions on how to create ritualistic objects and perform spells. One of the most disturbing medieval manuscripts is called the Grand Grimoire, also known as the Red Dragon or the Gospel of Satan. Rumored to be written in the 16th century, The writers dedicated the book to black magic, and it contained directions for summoning demons. Vatican authorities reportedly housed the original copy in the Vatican secret archives. For this reason, researchers can only trace the Grand Grimoire to the 19th century, when publishers created a new edition in France. According to legend, the authors wrote the original version in either Aramaic or Hebrew. Someone allegedly discovered it in 1750 in the Tomb of Solomon, although no one has ever verified the book's connection to the biblical king. Many believe that the Grand Grimoire is one of the most potent occult textbooks ever written. Someone named Honorius of Thebes, who experienced satanic possession firsthand, supposedly wrote it. The book contains 4 parts, including descriptions of demons, an account of how Satan corrupts newly elected popes over time, and instructions for summoning Lucifer himself. While some scholars believe the authors wrote the original Grand Grimoire during the 1800s, nobody has ever disproved the existence of an earlier copy being secretly tucked away at the Vatican. But the average person has no way of knowing, since we're not privy to that information. Mount Athos. For over 1,000 years, Russian Orthodox monks have lived in the monasteries at Mount Athos in northeastern Greece, where the monks strictly banned women from visiting. Described by The Guardian as the spiritual capital of the Orthodox Christian world, the site houses 20 monasteries that house around 2,000 monks. Some monks even choose to live in solitude outside the monasteries. Monks spend most of their daily lives praying, similar to how the monks who arrived during the 9th century passed their time. Services run for as long as 6 hours, but the monks continue to pray even when they are working, eating, and engaging in other activities. They go about their day silently, meditating on their connection with God. Monks who choose a mostly isolated existence live in small communities called skeets. Those who want no contact with the outside world live in the cliffside skeet of Karulia, where individual cells sit hundreds of feet above the water. People in a nearby community deliver the monks food and other supplies to them in a basket on a pulley, ensuring the continuation of their preferred distance from the rest of humanity. The monks ban female humans and animals alike from stepping foot onto Mount Athos, and they don't allow women within 500 meters of the coast. Leaders implemented this policy to maintain celibacy among the monks. It's said that the Virgin Mary visited Mount Athos when her ship blew off course while en route to Cyprus, and that she prayed to Jesus to receive the site as her own. It's Mary alone who represents women at Mount Athos. Women have gone to Mount Athos before, despite the ban. When the site granted sanctuaries to peasant livestock during the Greek Civil War from 1946 to 1949, a group of marauding women invaded in pursuit of the flocks. Then, in 1953, a Greek woman named Maria Pomenidou went there dressed as a man, causing the country's government to legislate the ban against women at Mount Athos. And in 2008, Ukrainian human traffickers dropped 4 Moldovan women off there, and the monks forgave their presence because of the extenuating circumstances. If you want to visit Mount Athos and you're a man, you must submit your passports to the Mount Athos Pilgrims Bureau. You can stay there for about 3 days. Taj Mahal Basement. Shah Jahan was the 5th Mughal Emperor of India. During his rule from 1628 to 1658, he brought the empire to its peak, ushering in the golden age of Mughal architecture with the commission of breathtaking monuments. His most famous building, the Taj Mahal, sits on a 42-acre plot in the modern-day Indian city of Agra. Workers built it in 1632 in honor of Shah Jahan's beloved wife Mumtaz, and is the couple's ultimate resting place. Officials keep their tombs in a locked chamber in the basement, and it's typically off-limits to visitors. There are 2 replica burials on public display on the building's first floor. Another theory proposes that Shah Jahan wanted to preserve the dead body of his wife, so he buried her according to the Unani techniques, as a mummy. A researcher named Armanul Haq, curator at the Museum of History, claimed that the Shah did indeed have her mummified. Visitors had a rare opportunity to see the real tombs firsthand on Shah Jahan's birthday in 2018. They were disappointed to find the burials in a deplorable state, blackened from years of neglect, and called on the government to restore them and make them accessible to the public. Allowing visitors to see the graves regularly would hold the authorities to higher standards to maintain them. Officials were cryptic in their response to the outrage, but this is nothing new. People have voiced many concerns about the Taj Mahal, only to be more or less stonewalled by the government. Many suspect that laborers built the monument on the site of a former Hindu temple, and that the basement contains Hindu artifacts and artwork. In 2019, Parliament member Subramanian Swamy claimed officials had these objects removed from the property years earlier. He also said that he had documentation proving that the Shah had the Taj Mahal built on stolen Hindu property. It's also believed that there may be 22 secret rooms beneath the building, but if they exist, only a privileged few know about them or what's inside, and these few are keeping quiet. Superconducting Super Collider. Nicknamed the Desertron, the Superconducting Super Collider, or SSC, was supposed to be the world's biggest and most energetic particle accelerator. If this vision had ever materialized, the result would have been a massive structure measuring over 54 miles in circumference. But things didn't exactly go as planned. The project came to an abrupt halt just 2 years after construction began in 1991. By then, the project had cost over $2 billion, yet construction crews had built only 14 miles of the tunnel. During the planning stages, the designers of the structure estimated the total cost at around $4.4 billion. Investors began losing confidence in 1993, when projected costs skyrocketed to over $8 billion. A report by the Inspector General from the Department of Energy criticized the Super Collider's officials for poor management and high costs. Eager to see the project through, then President Bill Clinton tried to stop it from being canceled, but Congress went against his wishes and revoked federal funding, ending the plans for good. The property changed hands several times over the following years. In the meantime, officials flooded some tunnels to keep stability, while they locked up others and left them as is. The site soon became a hotspot for criminals, partygoers, and other trespassers. Today, the property is home to an oil field product manufacturer, and it's strictly off-limits to outsiders. The Super Collider could have been a legendary project had it not failed. The US has yet to advance the way it once did in the realm of physics. But worse than that, the once prominent field of efficient energy production in the US has stopped daring to dream big. No matter what the future holds for high-energy physics in the US and the rest of the world, the imposing creation that could have been the superconducting Super Collider will not be forgotten. Poveglia. In northern Italy's Venetian lagoon, less than a half-mile from Venice, Poveglia is a small island that first appeared on the historical record during the 5th century. It remained inhabited until 1379, when its residents fled warfare. Then, starting in 1776, the government used Poveglia as a quarantine station for plague victims and sufferers of other diseases before becoming a mental hospital in 1992. The island has been vacant since the insane asylum closed in 1968, despite efforts in recent years to lease it as a luxury vacation spot. Rumors claim that as much as half the soil on Poveglia contains human remains, left behind by over 160,000 sick people who died there. Archaeologists have found mass graves containing the remains of thousands of plague victims on nearby islands, but archaeologists have yet to investigate Poveglia itself. Why is that? According to legend, a doctor who worked at the mental hospital in Poveglia tortured and killed patients before butchering them. While these claims remain unsubstantiated, the remains of the hospital are still there, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Many paranormal enthusiasts believe ghosts haunt Poveglia, but the island currently remains off-limits to visitors, and there is no word on if or when it will open up to tourism. For now, those who are curious about the supernatural can visit the nearby island of San Servolo, where the remains of an insane asylum are preserved as a museum. Thanks for watching! Would you rather visit the Vatican's secret archives or China's spy museum? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. See you next time! Bye!